Welcome to the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Come here weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network.
Hi, I'm Fawn Germer.
And I'm Michelle Brigman.
And this is the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast. Our guest today is Andrea Owen, an author, speaker, certified life coach, total guru. And I have to honestly tell you people how I ran across Andrea in my travels. So, as many of you know, I'm a motivational speaker and author, and people kept saying, you ought to be a life coach. And I thought, that's bullshit. So one day I'm sitting at home and I Google the words bullshit and life coach. And what comes up but Andrea Owen? Not because she's full of bullshit, but because she uses words like that all the time and is so authentic. She's the only person that I've ever met who has been able to get away with using the word shit in her title. So with that, Andrea, welcome to our podcast. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you. I think that was about 10 years ago.
I think so too. I was trying to figure that out.
It was towards the beginning of my career. And just in my defense, I don't use it like in my keynote titles. Like I do clean it up.
The corporate cleanup act. Right. I understand that totally. But, and I should also have a little asterisk next to that, which was that the reason I reached out to Andrea was not that she was authentic and funny, but was that the post that I saw was about her talking about her path into sobriety, which was raw and powerful. And I just wanted to cheer her on and encourage her and tell her she can do anything she wants because she can. So anyhow, I'm really glad to have you here on this show.
Thank you. Thank you. And that's such a fun, little trip down memory lane, because back then, and we can talk about this if you want, but back then there were bloggers that were sort of talking about their story, but there weren't a lot of people that I knew of who were professionals, like in the helping professional, who were talking about their stuff.
Right. And I really want to start there with that story of, where you began on your growth process and then where you are now.
That's a great question. So the growth process started just a few years before I became a bullshit life coach. Well, my life kind of fell apart, which I think for many people, that is sort of the catalyst of their own journey into betterment and evolving and consciousness. And I was married previously to a man whom I had been dating since I was 17. And we were 13 years into our relationship at that point. We'd been married for a couple of years and we're planning on conceiving our first child, and he had an affair with our neighbor and got her pregnant. So we divorced, and it was dramatic. Like the whole story, I'd be here for an hour and a half just telling that story. It was so much drama at every turn. He'd essentially been living a double life. And then I immediately started dating, which I should not have been doing, but I didn't have any tools. So I was like, let's just go this route. And I met someone great, and he unfortunately had terminal cancer. So I took care of him for several months and then started to suspect that he might be abusing prescription painkillers. So I asked him about it, and he admitted it and said that he was going to get sober, which he did, and then relapsed about a month later. And that's when I found out I was pregnant with his child. And then it went downhill very quickly from there. And within a couple of weeks, he had gone to rehab. And I also found out that he had lied about having cancer our entire relationship and had used that story to cover up his drug addiction the whole time, and had conned me essentially out of thousands of dollars, out of emotional support, so many things. And then I found out that I was not the first person that he had done that to. So he was legitimately a con man. So I did have the baby, and we do not have contact with him anymore. And I got remarried, but because people always they hate it when I leave them hanging. They're like, what happened after that? So I always have to tell them, I'm like, it's fine. But that was my rock bottom moment. I was pregnant. My divorce from my husband still wasn't even final. I was alone. And I just thought to myself, okay, what's the common denominator? And these two back-to-back terrible relationships where I had ignored my intuition. This isn't to put all the blame on me, but I had tolerated what I knew I shouldn't have been tolerating the whole time. And that's when I threw myself in. I really started to listen in therapy. I started going to 12-step meetings for codependence and just put myself on the fast track to personal development. And part of that was going to life coach training to get certified. And then that's really when everything started.
So how do you come from a place that's that sad, difficult, tumultuous and say, I know, I'm going to help other people fix themselves?
It was a coping mechanism. Like looking back, that was my way of avoiding my own stuff. I didn't realize. I was like, oh, if I do this, then I have to do my own stuff. I really thought I could avoid it. Full transparency. So that was 2007. And then I had a baby and I met Jason, who's my current husband. We had a baby, got married and had a baby together. So I had 2 babies within 2 years. And that's when I really was like, okay, I really need to look at my own stuff. I can't, well, and codependence, that's our live and die. Like we want to help everybody.
Right.
Let me ignore all the stuff in my life. Let me get into your business and fix your life and tell you what all your issues are. And I think, a lot of therapists will tell you the same thing, but it was a rude awakening. I'll say that. A good one, but.
So Andrea, I think, I'm thinking about just, wow.
Right.
First of all, that's,
I told you, we want her on our podcast.
Well, that's a lot. And it's a lot of, I think about times whenever I've gotten myself into situations that, I'm not stupid. Mm-hmm. And here I find myself in a situation, yet, I want to take on the shame. I want to protect it and hide it. And, it's hard to sort of find the strength within yourself to pull yourself up. So I'd love to understand a little bit more about, while you were at rock bottom, what was your support system? What were you saying to yourself to really find that inner strength to keep moving and come out to a better place? Because that wasn't I know that wasn't an easy transition the way it kind of just sounded.
No. And I had a great support system, but it's hard to explain. And maybe let me stumble my way through it. And I think people listening to this will probably understand what I'm trying to say. I had really great friends and, a few members of my family who were there for me, but to a point, how when you're when it's your darkest hour, and I don't know about anyone else listening, but it was this weird paradox of I truly wanted to be seen in all of my pain and all of my shame and all that had happened to me. But it was also the thing that I was the most afraid of. So it was this tricky spot of the push pull and I want to tell my whole story. I want to be able to completely break down and fall apart in front of people, fetal position on the floor. But yet I really don't want you to see that. So for a while it was, and also I should say too, Michelle, my personality, I am naturally optimistic and enthusiastic. So I think that really came to my benefit to allow me to hold on to hope. And I'll say this last thing, which isn't the healthiest thing at the time, but a lot of my motivation came from wanting to show up my ex-husband and just say you can't destroy me. Watch me turn this into $1 million business. I did.
Well, we've heard that before on this podcast, haven't we, Michelle?
Yeah.
I can think of 2 other people specifically.
And I tell people you have to use whatever's going to get you out of bed every day. But I also had to look at that and realize I have to do it for me as well.
Thank you.
That's amazing. It's the lesson in Tijuana, Mexico. You share that in your new book, Make Some Noise. So,
yeah. Well, and I should say I was born and raised in San Diego, and Tijuana is just a hop, skip, and a jump over the border. And I'd been down there many times, and back in the early 90s, when I was a young adult, we used to go down because the drinking age is only 18. So we used to cross the border a lot to go down there to the bars and clubs and had a really fun time. But this was later in the mid 2000s. And Tijuana had gotten pretty dangerous. I think it was always been dangerous, but we didn't know when we were teenagers, nor did we care. But mid 2000s, they were really having some problems. So it was dangerous, especially at night. So my boyfriend who had cancer, who had fake cancer, told me early on in the relationship that he could get his medication down in Tijuana because it was not FDA approved here in the States, but it was in Europe, and we could get it in Tijuana, Mexico. So why would I not believe him? So we would go down there during the day and take these day trips down there, and it was fine, but it got a little, it just, when you're going down there every weekend in the summer, it's not fun to stand in line on your way back. And I just was kind of like, oh, this kind of sucks, but he had cancer. So it's like, who am I to complain? So it was one evening and he was very sick. In retrospect, he was going through withdrawals from opioids, but I thought he was sick from his cancer. And he said, we need to go down there. And I was like, the pharmacies are closed. You know, they had regular operating hours. And he's like, we need to just go down. So we go down there. We're walking down this alleyway behind this like stretch of buildings. And there's these two guys standing like outside of the back of a building. And he said, stay right here. And he walked about 30 feet away from me. And it's very dark at this point. And could hear him. And I don't think he intended for me to hear this. He asked the men, hey, do you guys know where I can get any OxyContin? And I had been suspicious. And at that moment, it was one of those, okay, I can't unhear this. I know this is what is happening. So then he walks back to me and I'm thinking like, what do I do? I have to just kind of go along with it. Like he's my ride back. Like this was before Uber and everything. And so we walk down a little ways and then we get into there's a cab and he opens the back door to the cab for me to get in. And everything in my body at that moment was screaming, don't get in, go back, break up with him, walk away from this relationship. This is dangerous. And I looked at him and I said, I don't want to get in. And he walked towards me. He was like 6'3". He looked like David Duchovny. He was handsome and charming and funny. And he put my face in his hands and he said, I would never do anything to jeopardize your safety. And I got in the cab and we drove to some house out on a gravel road. And the whole time I'm thinking, if I die, no one knows where I am. Like I hadn't told my friends the situation because I was embarrassed and ashamed of where I was. Like I was 31, you know, I wasn't like a 16-year-old girl anymore. Like I knew better. And, of course I was paying for it because he had quit his job and didn't have any money. So I hand him a wad of 20s and we get the medication. And you would think that I would have broke up with him right after that, but I didn't. It took me several months, but that cab ride was so incredibly painful, sitting there, knowing what was really going on, like knowing the truth of my circumstances, but also being in that place of, do I have the strength to walk away from this?
Yeah.
And knowing that I didn't, and being angry at myself for where I was at.
Because you're a strong woman, you're smart, you're capable, and you're sitting there going, I would never tolerate this with my friends or for a friend or loved one. What in the world am I doing?
What am I doing? It's that cognitive dissonance that I think so many people have been in, whether they are deconstructing their religion or it's their family of origin that they're at Thanksgiving with, and they realize that they have very different values, or I think there's so many different circumstances where we can be in that place. And I kind of call it like the point of no return, where we can't go back because we know exactly where we're at, but we also don't have the strength and fortitude to take the action to get out. And that is an incredibly painful place to be, and also carries a lot of shame that I think drives people staying in that place.
And I think there's a whole heck of a lot of women, which is what you talk about. There's a whole heck of a lot of women that are sitting right there in that point of no return. And I think it's awesome about.
And sometimes it's an economic problem. Like the women can't leave because they truly are trapped, whether they have children or their significant other is controlling the finances. There's so many. So I'm not going to sit here and say like, you have to get out. It's your only option. Like I realize that your safety comes first. And that was something that I thought about too. I'm like, what is this guy capable of if he's going to go to these lengths? Like it was scary.
Well, and I think it's a really good example for when you're in that kind of a personal trauma situation and it's so horrible. But there are so many times in our lives when we are given a choice to turn left or turn right, and left is the wrong way and you're being pushed and it doesn't feel comfortable because everyone else is going left. And it's really hard to say, no, I'm going to go this way. I know better. And it's lonely to do that. It takes a lot of strength. And so you started working on yourself. You did all the self-help. You became the life coach. And then things started taking off. And quite amazingly.
Quickly.
So I've told you I had to find a clean way to say this, but I'll just put on at this point, after going through all of that, how messed up are you still?
Like on a scale of 1 to 10, I think 10 being like where I was at previously, and
So that's your lowest?
a 0 being like Buddha, like not having any problems. I would say I'm like a 4. The pandemic really, I think, threw a lot of people for a loop. Like we were stuck with ourselves. And for me, as someone who I was diagnosed with anxiety disorder in 2003, I was in my late 20s. I have a family history of depression and anxiety and just neurodivergence. And my anxiety went through the roof in the beginning of the pandemic. And I also realized there's still some trauma here that just hasn't been ready to come out over the last almost decade and a half. And now it was like kind of scratching its way to the surface, saying, okay, I'm ready, and it was layered. We all have these layers. Part of it was, my daddy issues with, my father, and then, some really difficult things happened to me when I was a teenager that I had shoved down, and I got sober in 2011. And so that's really when all the feelings started to bubble up to the surface, and they didn't come up all at once. And I think that happens to a lot of people. Like we're ready when we're ready. And I think thankfully for my nervous system, not everything came to the surface at once. And so when, spring 2020 happened, it was still stuff. And so I hired a new therapist. And I'm still working on it. Like now, today, as we're recording this, like I'm working on healing my inner teenager. We hear so much about people healing their inner child, which is fantastic and important work. But for a lot of us, like the inner teenager is different from the inner child. Like that 13 to like 20 for me, like when you understand, you see things through a different lens than you did when you were a child, and pain happens, but you also aren't an adult to be able to handle it or really have a whole lot of autonomy or power. I still have rage from like my 17-year-old self who went through some stuff and just did not have the emotional capacity and tools to be able to handle it. So that's what I'm dealing with now in 2022. And that was a long time ago. I'm 46 now. It was 30 years ago.
I love that you're so honest about that. And that you find out that maybe there's no there, that you're going to be looking at all of this stuff for the rest of your life. And so you just kind of have to make peace with the moment and live for the day and all of that. But, the pandemic made it hard for people to do that. And I'm shocked at the number of people whose relationships that I thought were rock solid have collapsed because of it. And people that I thought had things figured out, maybe not so much as I'd assumed, that they've had a rough time. And so have you seen a lot of this in your practice? And how do you coach people through that when you're going through it yourself?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I learned early on as a child was how to compartmentalize. It was a coping mechanism. Like I grew up in a family, and I've always been this way, like just almost like word vomit, but just completely transparent. Like I want everyone to know that the emperor is naked. Like, why isn't everybody talking about this? And I felt that as a child and did not grow up in a home where anything was talked about. It was very much shoved down. And I think it partly is generational. My parents didn't have the tools. They weren't raised like that either. And so I don't blame and shame them. But also it was traumatizing to grow up like that. So to answer your question, I learned how to compartmentalize in an unhealthy way. And then through my training, we call it self-management. They don't call it compartmentalizing, but it's basically the same thing, where I am able to completely focus on what's going on with my client instead of my own stuff. However, sometimes those lines get blurred, especially if my client brings a topic that I am dealing with the exact same thing. A lot of times I will just say it out loud to get it out in the open. So it's not an elephant in the room. So it's not a naked emperor. And so I can just say, I want to let you know, for the sake of total transparency, that I'm going through something very, very similar. So you might see me hesitate as I am asking you a question. And if you want me to be transparent and like take my coach hat off and speak like woman to woman, we can do that. Just let me know. I have found that just saying what's there solves so many problems.
So validating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you've got those 2 videos that I think everybody needs to go to YouTube to see, what's the title about coaches, what coaches say?
Shit life coaches say. It was kind of a trend that was happening in 2012.
All right. I want to make sure they hear that. The shit life coaches say. It is so funny.
It is funny.
What do life coaches say?
They say things like, we use a lot of metaphors. In the video, my friend Amy is laying on the couch and they teach us to like get in positions if we're using a metaphor. And she's laying on the couch and she's like, it's like you're in a coffin. So, like if someone's feeling trapped in their job or something, and then cut to a scene of me telling my client, it feels like you're birthing this project. So do something with me. And I get on the couch and I'm like pretending like I'm giving birth and I'm bearing down. It's just corny, but it's helpful.
Oh, it's funny. But weren't you brushing your teeth? And it was
brushing my teeth and thinking about like I'm setting my intentions for the day. And I told myself, I'm just going to focus on being the woman I want to become.
And so, but I like the fact that you're pretty blunt and upfront about coaches. And a lot of people who listen to this podcast do have coaches or are looking for them. So how do they find one who actually is not in the bullshit category?
Referrals help so much. And also I am someone who will get up on her soapbox about credentials. It's funny for fun. Like now that we are here 10 years later, I don't lead with life coach. Like I tell people I'm an author and a speaker. The industry has in some ways become bastardized because there's no licensure. And our only governing body is the International Coaching Federation. And in my opinion, they really cater towards executive coaches. They don't really cater to life coaches. And so anyone can hang a shingle out and call themselves a life coach. And I kind of hate that. Like, I think that you need to have some training. Like, it's a very hot topic in the industry. There are people who are like, but I've been consulting for companies and individuals for decades. Doesn't that qualify me? A lot of times it does. It totally does. Like I would trust you, like to coach someone 100%. However, I have also had people who pitch to come on my show and they'll say that they specialize in trauma and helping people recover from their trauma. This just happened. And I went to this person's site looking for her credentials and she didn't have any. So my team reached out to her and asked her and she said, oh, I don't have any. I've just walked through my own trauma. And I'm like,
oh my God.
No.
Dangerous.
Red flag.
Red flag, big time.
Look for credentials, look for experience. Those people cost more, but I think it's important. And referrals are always helpful.
Michelle, have you ever used a coach?
So sort of. I mean, first of all, like I have a certification as a health coach that I got, I went through a year worth of training to do that. Not because I had dreamed of being a health coach, but a little like you, I was on my own journey and I was just trying to drive some personal accountability. So through that, yes, I have met other people who are more experienced than myself. And I have used them. I'm currently meeting with someone now that is amazing as a life coach. And it's a great, I mean, for me, right? But it's somebody credentialed, like they are licensed as a therapist as well as a life coach.
That's fantastic.
And I lean on that life coach side, but I know that there's a ton of training and experience behind it. I tell you what, highly recommend it, dealing with those real life situations, just having someone to ask you better questions, because I'm pretty self-aware,
Yeah.
but I find that there's questions either I don't know to ask, or frankly, I don't want to ask myself. And sometimes just having that other person force me to think about it is very eye-opening and helps me get over some of the hurdles.
Yeah.
That's a great way of explaining it.
Well, so how would you describe the difference between a life coach and an executive coach?
Well, an executive coach is your focus is going to be work and your performance there, your results, your relationships with your colleagues, your relationships with your clients. And the coach has to have an understanding of workplace culture, of just corporate life in general. And a life, and that's not to say that your corporate coach or your executive coach isn't going to talk to you about stuff going on at home. They usually are, because a lot, especially, women who struggle with work-life balance, it's going to become a topic. And a life coach, typically my clients come to me because since I'm a person in recovery, I do get a fair amount of people, probably half of my clients come to me because they are curious about their relationship with alcohol. Not all of them, I think, identify as addicts or alcoholics. It's just, they kind of get lost in the mommy wine culture, or just a culture that's obsessed with alcohol, in my opinion. Or they bring things like I had a client come to me recently, and it was a couple, and they had just been procrastinating on a bunch of things that were important, and they couldn't seem to figure out why they kept procrastinating, and they wanted to get back on with their fitness. And so some people hire me a lot for the accountability, because they're paying me to light a fire under their ass. But I also go ask a lot of questions, like, why do you think you're procrastinating on this? And so sometimes it does go a little bit deeper. I got off track there a little bit. Like, I'm just trying to give you examples of what people hire me for. So I'm also trained and certified in the work of Dr. Brene Brown, which is attractive to a lot of people because it's shame work. And they know, or at least curious, that some of their behaviors that they don't think are healthy are based in shame. So they want to uncover that.
So why would someone choose a life coach when really a lot of these problems are things that psychologists and therapists are more trained to deal with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I often send people to therapy who come to me, and I have learned over the years to have a really great intake questionnaire. And sometimes I don't know until we really get into a couple sessions. And a lot of my clients work with me and a therapist, partly because I tell them they should go back or go to therapy as well. But a lot of people come to life coaching because they've been through therapy, and they have that self-awareness of, okay, I know why I act like this. It's because of X, Y, and Z. And they've probably made some progress on it, but they feel like they're stuck. And one of the things that's attractive about life coaching is that many life coaches have a different relationship with their clients than a therapist does. And the industry is changing. People ask me, who are interested in becoming a life coach now in 2022. And I say, if you have the option, go to grad school and become a therapist, and then also call yourself a coach, because it's just more attractive. You're going to get more clients. You have a way bigger toolbox. And then you can also basically do therapy. I didn't say that, outside of your state. So that's why that's attractive, because it's the best of both worlds. If I had to start all over, that's absolutely what I would do. But clients get to a point where they have the self-awareness, they understand why they're doing the things that they're doing, they're conscious about it, but yet they want that deeper relationship to be able to have their coach message them in between sessions. They're going to follow up, because we all kind of specialize in something different. One of the things I specialize in is the accountability. I'm going to ask you about the things we talked about in the last session. Did you do it? If you didn't, I'm not mad at you, but let's talk about it. What's holding you back? And I'm not saying this is I don't mean to generalize, but a lot of therapists, you just like kind of only meet once a week or every other week. And they just kind of like whatever the client wants to bring to the topic. It's kind of an old school model of therapy.
Yeah. Well, and I do both therapy and life coach, and my therapist conversations are much more, I like to get into the science of everything, like how this works. Whereas with my coach, it's a woman. So my therapist is a man, my coach is a woman who has been through similar things. So it's a very different interaction and conversation I can have with her, but I find value in both, just to give a tangible, tangible kind of example.
At this point, I don't have either one. I just have Michelle.
And your kayak. That's what you have.
That's it. So, okay, Michelle, how do you like this title of her last book? How to Stop Feeling Like Shit, 14 Habits That Are Holding You Back from Happiness.
Oh, I love just thinking that could be just 14 things, not 114.
Not 13, not 15.
Well, that title, there's so much to unpack in that. First thing, but the thing I want to know is, did your publisher buy it because you used that word in the title, or was there a fight so that you could?
So that was actually my second book. I was married to that title, which they, if you go traditional publishing, the advice is don't marry titles because they will probably change it. That happened to me with my first book and my third book. But when I wrote the proposal for my second book, I told my agent, I am married to this title. I think it's brilliant. I think it matches me and who I am. And so I really don't want to sell this to somebody who's going to want to change it. So he thought it was hilarious. And so keep in mind, this was in 2015 that we were selling that. So this was before, there's so many books out now that have, the F word in the title. There's been New York Times bestsellers with the F word in the title. And so it was early on, and it was still a little bit of a liability. It was still a little bit of a risk, but he didn't have any problem selling it. And they weren't worried about it. And I think it was really good timing for me too, because I was one of the first to come out with the title with that word on the cover, which didn't happen very often.
And that's been your biggest book, right?
By far.
Yeah. And
it screams at you, buy me. You need to read this book.
So okay. Then with what Michelle said, so how did you come up with the magic 14? And since that would take a long time to go through all of them, what are the biggest things that
the top ones?
Yeah.
That book was born from my training that I told you about that I did in 2014 with Brene Brown and her senior faculty. And so she talks about, if anyone's familiar with her work and has read like Daring Greatly or Dare to Lead, she talks about something called armor. And the armor are the behaviors that we employ when we are trying to avoid shame or vulnerability or failure, criticism. So this is things like perfectionism, people pleasing, isolating and hiding out, overachieving for some, being strong. So in the training, in that particular lesson, when we're facilitating that work, she talks about the top 3 that she found from her research, which was perfectionism, foreboding joy, which I call catastrophizing. So that's kind of like rehearsing tragedy, like when things are going great and you're like, oh my God, what's going to happen now? Like everything's going to fall apart. And then the third one was numbing out. Like that's like the drinking too much, the shopping, the phones, et cetera. And what I realized in my community was there was a lot more. And my clients were coming to me and saying, yes, I do those, but also I people please. Also, I'm an overachiever, also hyper independence. So I just started writing it down. And that's how I came up with all of them. Those are probably the most glaring that I saw from my community. So the top ones probably are the numbing out, the isolating and hiding out, which are different. And probably with my audience, probably control is the other top one.
Boy, there's a lot in all of those. Give a brief summary of all 3. And then
so the numbing out, that's for people who are afraid to feel their feelings, or they don't even know what their feelings are, but they just know that they're big and they don't have the skill set to not only process the feelings, but also to trust themselves enough to know that if and when they do process them, they're not going to die. because it's a physiological thing that happens when we face really difficult things and then just kind of try to push them down. And I think we all do this to an extent. And then the isolating and hiding out. So that is when you don't reach out to tell people what's really going on. Or you might tell someone a story and you just tell them the facts. It's just like this happened, and this happened. And you don't tell them how you were feeling, or you minimize how you were feeling. So or some people just don't share anything at all. And things are hard. I will get through it myself. And like, as Americans, I think, this is our creed. It's like this hyper independence, this rugged individualism, like, I'm going to get through it. And then the control is people feel safer when they have certainty. I mean, that's just how we are as humans. So if I can control all of this, whether it's your weight, your appearance, the way you dress, the way you show up, or if I can control outcomes, so that's like micromanaging, getting really upset, when things don't go your way, not being good with transitions. And some of this is like how people are wired too. Like there's a few variables. But when it kind of reaches into codependence, when you're so obsessed with controlling everything in an effort to avoid your own stuff, that's where it gets a little tricky.
Boy,
I think what's great is you do a lot to share steps to confront and move forward beyond that place. I know just in looking at your books, that is, I think that, I encourage that if any of those things are resonating with our audience, right, that's a great place to, you talk about pull out a piece of paper and start journaling and ask yourselves these questions, because I think, they want to know, okay, so what do I do? What's next?
I always tell people take it to therapy. I feel like a lot of my work is a precursor to therapy. And it's taken me a long time to realize that. Like in Make Some Noise, my last book, I ask over 150 questions in the book. Like it's basically, I'm coaching the reader, and it's not going to fix your life. Like, I'm not going to say that it is, but it certainly is going to make you realize some things. And I encourage people to take that to their therapist.
Well, but it's interesting because I think that's why for a long time, I haven't gone to therapy, because I would go to therapy and they would ask me questions and I would tell the answers. So then I thought, I kind of know the questions. So I write them down and I journal. And I can see a lot of value in what you're doing there, is saying, answer this, do that. But it's curious, because if it's a precursor, isn't life coaching more expensive than therapy?
A lot of times, yes.
Yeah.
It's because it's not licensed, so it's not covered by insurance.
Is it faster? Is your relationship with your life coach shorter than with your therapist?
Usually, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And like, that's why I like to take people through an entire, I don't like to call it a step-by-step process, but it kind of is. Like the work that I facilitate in Brene Brown, like, I love that it's based in research and it's a formula. It's essentially a formula of shame resilience. And so I've seen it change my own life. And the thing here's kind of a differentiator about when is life coaching appropriate and when is therapy appropriate. If you get to a place where you realize something that hurt you in the past and you keep kind of like the plane won't land, like you keep going in circles. Uh-huh. So what that might look like is if you keep arguing with your partner about the same thing, or if something keeps happening at work and you have like a physiological response to it, like the blood drains from you, or you see someone at work that you have some interactions with and you just feel incredibly intimidated by this person. And that's where I would tap someone on the shoulder and be like, you might want to go talk to your therapist about that. Like what's going on? Like if it's impeding your life in some way, for sure, go to therapy and talk about it. And a life coach might be able to help you through that as well.
It's interesting to see how far you have come. It's powerful. It's like,
isn't it great?
What's powerful is you say, I don't have the answers. And I think the thing that's touching me deepest is then I think about Michelle, who's got such an amazing story, and seeing her go, year by year, growing. And maybe we go through all of this not to get the answers, but to get the power, because you're tougher to deal with more.
Yeah. Well,
I like that.
It's beautiful. Beautiful. I think you've just given us so much here, Andrea. I mean, first of all, congratulations to you. I mean, just you deserve like a really great shout out because you had the courage to do the work, right?
Yeah.
To look in the mirror and say, all right, it's on me to get out of this. And also the courage to look at yourself and say, I'm worth a whole heck of a lot more than what's going on right now. And I'm going to honor that. And I know that that's not an easy path and an easy journey to do. And I can see why your story and the way you support people really resonates. And I'm just completely amazed by the courage you have in terms of being so transparent about what you've gone through, because I know there's been a price that's had to have come from that as well. You know, you've had to walk away and you've lost some things because of it. But wow, looking at where you are right now, you didn't know it at the time, but you just obviously are gaining so much more than you ever imagined. And I think it's just such a great reminder to me, to us, our listeners, that that, you know, you have what's in you to do it. And I thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you.
And I encourage people to check out all of your places, because you're like,
your podcast.
I don't like Instagram, the book, like you've got a lot of stuff going on. So where can people catch up with you?
Probably the podcast is the first place I'd love to send people to. It's called Make Some Noise with Andrea Owen. Also the title of my third book that just came out last year. But you know where I've been loving, and I don't know how much your audience is going to love this, but I've amassed quite a following on TikTok. just by being funny and like myself, that medium and the mental health community on TikTok is really growing. And, you know, a lot of Gen Xers and baby boomers are downloading the app and having a lot of fun over there and learning a lot.
It's been a lot of fun. And I hope they keep following you, because you again, you've learned some really hard-won wisdom and you're using it for good. And thank you.
Yeah, this is the perfect title of the podcast for my life. I feel like so I'm honored to be here and tell my story. Thank you.
Well, we love you, Andrea. Come back.
I will.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining the Hard Won Wisdom podcast with best-selling author Von Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Join us weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network. Visit hardwonwisdom.com for more on this podcast and for links to Fawn and Michelle's web pages and social media. Also, be sure to rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort, and we'll see you next week.